All right, let's go.
Clear the area!
The first light of dawn slices through a sky choked with mist and ash. Below the dark surface of the Pacific, glimmers like steel, broken only by the distant silhouette of Mount Fuji, silent, indifferent, eternal. But above that calm horizon, something impossible is happening. 91 American P-51D Mustangs race across the ocean at treetop height, their silver wings streaked with salt spray, their engines screaming in perfect harmony. No one believed single-engine fighters could fly this far, 750 miles over open water, and yet here they are, cutting through the morning haze like a blade aimed at the heart of the empire. In the lead cockpit, Major James Tapp tightens his grip on the control stick, eyes fixed on the rising sun ahead. His 6 .50 caliber Brownings are loaded his fuel just enough for a round trip if the wind holds. Behind him, an entire generation of young men follows every heartbeat, synchronized with the hum of the Merlin engines that keep them alive. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese capital sleeps under the illusion that its skies are untouchable. That illusion is about to end. For years, the Pacific had belonged to distance, to the tyranny of miles and fuel and fear. But on this morning, distance itself is conquered. The line between the hunter and the hunted will vanish in the glare of sunlight over Tokyo Bay. And as the Mustangs climb toward the rising flame, history takes a sharp, metallic breath, moments before the storm begins. They had taken off from the black sands of Iwo Jima before sunrise, engines howling in unison, propellers cutting through the humid Pacific air. The volcanic island fell away behind them, shrinking to a dot in the ocean as the horizon swallowed it whole. Every man in that formation knew he was flying into the unknown, 750 miles of empty sea, no alternate airfield, no second chances. The mission's success, even their survival, depended on a single machine, the North American P-51D Mustang. What allowed those men to reach Tokyo that morning was not luck or divine favor, but the cold precision of engineering and the relentless logic of innovation. The Mustang had not been born from myth, but from urgency. When the war began, American bombers flying over Europe were slaughtered without long-range escorts. Heavy fighters couldn't keep up, and light fighters couldn't go the distance. The Army Air Forces needed something that seemed impossible, a single-engine aircraft fast enough to outfight anything in the sky, strong enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back, and efficient enough to stretch its endurance across entire oceans. North American aviation took that challenge, and in less than 120 days, built the first prototype, a gamble of metal and mathematics that would rewrite aviation history. The secret of the Mustang's triumph lay not in its weapons, but in its wings. Edgar Schmude, the German-born designer behind its shape, created a laminar flow airfoil unlike anything before it. The wings were thin, sleek, and engineered to keep airflow smooth across a greater portion of the surface, reducing drag by nearly a third. At high speeds, where turbulence devoured fuel and control, the Mustang sliced through the air as if gliding on invisible rails. Combined with a fuselage refined through hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing, it was a machine that could cheat the wind itself. But wings alone would not conquer distance. The early models, powered by Allison engines, were swift at low altitude, yet suffocated above 15,000 feet, the very heights where the war was being fought. Then came the marriage that changed everything. The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, reborn in America as the Packard V1650. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger fed the Mustang's heart with oxygen, even at 3,000 feet, where Japanese and German engines gasped for air. The result was staggering: 440 miles per hour, 4,200 feet of ceiling, and a range that stretched into the realm of the impossible. Engineers didn't stop there. They equipped the fighter with 6 .50 caliber Browning M, 2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, synchronized for a convergence point that could tear through armor and ignite fuel tanks in a fraction of a second. Each gun carried up to 400 rounds, giving the pilot nearly 2 minutes of sustained fire, an eternity in aerial combat. The ammunition mix was deadly science, armor-piercing incendiary and tracer rounds interlaced in perfect rhythm. When a Mustang opened fire, it didn't shoot bullets. It spat molten geometry arcs of fire, designed by mathematicians, manufactured by factories, and delivered by men who had learned to fly through death. The Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a system. Every inch of its frame was calculated for efficiency, from its laminar wings to its streamlined radiator, that actually produced thrust through the Meredith effect, converting engine heat into additional speed. Its cockpit, compact yet intuitive, was built around the pilot's instincts, every gauge visible at a glance, every switch reachable with a gloved hand. It was the first warplane that seemed to anticipate its pilot's movements, a living extension of his will. This synthesis of human and machine reached its zenith in the P-51D model, the very aircraft now soaring over Tokyo Bay. Equipped with a bubble canopy that offered 360-degree visibility, the D model gave pilots eyes in the back of their heads, a priceless advantage in dogfights, where survival often hinged on a split second. Its drop tanks, 2 sleek cylinders beneath the wings, carried an extra 220 gallons of high-octane fuel. They could be jettisoned the moment combat began, allowing the fighter to shed weight and leap into battle with full agility. With those tanks, a pilot could cross the Pacific fight for 30 minutes and still have enough fuel to return home. The tyranny of distance had been broken by the geometry of aluminum and fire. What made the Mustang truly extraordinary, however, wasn't its speed or firepower, it was its reliability. Built in assembly lines that ran 24 hours a day, it was produced with tolerances so exact that parts from one aircraft fit perfectly on another. Mechanics could swap wings, engines, or instruments in hours, not days. This standardization was the quiet miracle of American industry. Each Mustang rolling off the line in California or Texas was nearly identical, predictable, and dependable. A pilot could climb into any cockpit and know precisely how the machine would respond. That trust between man and metal was what made those dawn missions possible. The Japanese would later call it a ghost, a fighter that appeared from nowhere, struck with blinding precision, and vanished into the Sunday. But there was nothing supernatural about it. The Mustang was the visible proof of a nation that had turned its factories, scientists, and laborers into an unstoppable engine of creation. Where Japan built by hand, America built by formula. Where Japan fought with spirit, America fought with systems. And on that morning over Tokyo Bay, those systems sang with mechanical perfection, their Merlin engines harmonizing like a metallic choir, announcing the death of distance. As the formation climbed higher sunlight glinting off silver fuselages, each pilot could feel the tension between awe and fear, the awareness that they were flying not just into combat, but into a new era. They were no longer merely soldiers. They were the operators of a machine that had transcended the limits of human endurance. The P-51D had turned the impossible into a routine, the ocean into a runway, and the sky into a factory of destruction. In that transformation lay the essence of modern warfare, a conflict no longer defined by courage alone, but by calculation, production, and design. Technology had ceased to be a servant of war. It had become its architect. The Mustang wasn't built to win a single battle, it was built to redefine what battles could be fought at all. And as the sun rose higher over the Pacific, painting the clouds in molten gold, the truth of that revolution echoed through the engines. The age of limits was over, and the age of machines had begun. While the Mustangs carved silver paths across the sky, their enemies waited below in the shadows of a dying empire. Japan's engineers, once proud masters of precision, now worked under flickering lights in half-bombed factories, surrounded by the ghosts of an industrial dream that was collapsing piece by piece. The same country that had once built the Zero swift, graceful, and unstoppable in the early years of the war, was now trying to match America's machine with nothing but willpower and fragments of steel. The contest was no longer just between pilots or squadrons. It was a war of production lines of factories versus workshops of abundance against exhaustion. In 1944, Japan introduced its answer to the Mustang, the Nakajima Ki 84 Hayate or Gale. On paper, it was formidable, fast maneuverable, armed with twin 20mm cannons and twin 12.7mm guns. In controlled tests, it could reach nearly 425 miles per hour and climb faster than most Allied aircraft. But those numbers lived only in reports and prototypes. The battlefield told another story. Each Hayate that rolled out of the factory was different, some fast, some sluggish, some so fragile that their landing gear crumpled on the first touchdown. The same engine that promised 2,000 horsepower too often delivered a cough, a rattle, and then silence. The problem wasn't design. It was the nation itself, starved of everything that kept an industrial war alive. Allied submarines had severed the sea lanes that once carried oil, bauxite, and rubber from Southeast Asia. Refineries burned nightly under the glare of B-29 firebombing. Power plants flickered on and off like dying candles. The once synchronized rhythm of Japan's war machine had become a cacophony of shortages. Skilled machinists were drafted into infantry units. Teenage apprentices took their place on the assembly lines, working by candlelight, grinding metal too soft to withstand the heat of combat. Fuel, the lifeblood of flight, became Japan's slow executioner. By 1945, aviation gasoline was so scarce that fighter pilots trained in simulators built from wooden cockpits bolted to the ground. The few real flights they made often ended in engine seizures or forced landings. Desperate chemists tried to squeeze fuel from pine roots, brewing a foul mixture that corroded engines and clogged injectors. Octane levels fell from 100 to 80, then to whatever number meant barely combustible. Each takeoff consumed more of the Empire's future. Every mission was borrowed time. The factories that produced the Ki-84 mirrored that desperation. Steel shipments arrived, warped and contaminated with impurities. Aluminum became so rare that airframes were patched with iron sheets scavenged from destroyed warehouses. Quality control evaporated. Bolts didn't fit, rivets snapped, landing gear bent under the weight of the aircraft. Mechanics used hammers where precision tools were meant to be guessing torque by instinct rather than calibration. What rolled out of Nakajima's gates was not a weapon of war, it was a gamble wrapped in camouflage paint. Yet within this ruin, fragments of genius still glimmered. Japanese engineers continued to innovate, even as everything around them burned. They refined supercharger designs, experimented with methanol injection, and dreamt of jets that could reclaim the sky. But dreams could not fight arithmetic. Every new design demanded resources that no longer existed. The Hayate remained a blueprint of what might have been a promise crushed beneath the weight of its own shortage. Meanwhile, American factories roared like furnaces of creation. The contrast was obscene. In California, engines rolled off assembly lines by the thousands, identical down to the last bolt. In Texas, entire wings were stamped, tested, and shipped before dusk. Workers operated in shifts around the clock, guided by precision gauges and management systems that turned chaos into order. For every Mustang built, Japan might complete one Hayate if the electricity held. The gap widened with every sunrise. While American pilots trusted their machines implicitly, Japanese aviators climbed into cockpits, whispering prayers. Some painted charms on the dashboard, others wrote farewell notes and tucked them beneath their flight jackets. They fought not only the enemy, but the betrayal of their own equipment. Engines overheated, oil lines burst, weapons jammed. The Hayate's 30mm cannons could shatter a B-29 with one hit, but they carried only 50 rounds per gun, and ammunition shortages meant some planes flew with empty cannons altogether. What looked lethal on paper was hollow in the sky. The Empire's technological pride had become its curse. Its engineers understood flight. Its factories could no longer build it. The perfect machine was trapped inside imperfect materials. Even the paint that coated the aircraft peeled under tropical heat because the chemical binders were gone. A pilot might take off in something that gleamed like a Predator and return in something that looked decades old if he returned at all. Each Hayate that reached the front line carried not only a pilot but an entire nation's exhaustion. The roar of its radial engine was the sound of desperation disguised as defiance. And when those fighters rose to meet the Mustangs over Tokyo, they brought courage but no margin for error. Against the cold precision of American machines, every defect was fatal. In the great equation of industrial war, Japan's side of the ledger was written in scarcity. Its production lines resembled triage wards, saving what they could, improvising the rest. Mechanics reused spark plugs until they cracked, stripped metal from wrecked aircraft, patched bullet holes with tin and hope. Every repair was an act of faith. Every flight was a wager against physics. Across the ocean, America's solution to the same problem was repetition and standardization. If one machine failed, 10 more took its place. If a part broke, another fit perfectly shipped from a warehouse already stocked with thousands. It was not romance or courage that won the skies, it was predictability. The Mustang pilot flew within a system that promised consistency. The Hayate pilot flew within a system that prayed for miracles. By the spring of 1945, the contrast was unbearable. American engineers debated incremental improvements. Japanese crews debated whether their planes would start. The industrial duel that had begun in optimism ended in entropy, and as the Mustangs crossed the Pacific that morning, their silver wings reflecting the dawn, they carried more than ammunition and fuel. They carried proof that mass production had become a weapon greater than any cannon. The skies over Tokyo would soon reveal the outcome. One side flew machines born from endless resources, precision tools, and coordinated logistics. The other rose on fragments, each flight a testament to human courage fighting mechanical decay. It was not a fair contest, nor a symmetrical war. It was the inevitable collision between two worlds, one building toward perfection, the other crumbling under its own weight. And as the engines of the Hayate sputtered to life in smoke and prayer, the die was already cast. One nation would fight with design and steel, the other with faith and fragments. The future belonged to the side that could build it. The first enemy blips appeared on radar just after 0700 hours, small erratic signals climbing out of the haze east of Tokyo Bay. To the men of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, it meant only one thing: the Japanese had found them. The air ahead shimmered with sunlight, the horizon burning gold when black specks began to rise from the ground like angry insects. In seconds, the sky erupted into motion. More than 100 Japanese fighters clawed upward, engines roaring, wings glinting crimson in the dawn. They came fast, reckless, certain they were chasing ghosts. For years their commanders had sworn that no American fighter could reach the home islands, and yet here they were, silver machines tearing through the clouds, engines howling like sirens of judgment. Major James Tapp was the first to spot them, tiny crosses climbing straight into the Sunday. His heart hammered in rhythm with the Merlin's thrum. "Here they come," he muttered, rolling his Mustang into a climbing turn. Around him the formation tightened. 91 P-51Ds arced upward in a single fluid motion, sunlight catching their polished skins like shards of lightning. Above 2,000 feet, the air thinned to glass. Every movement was amplified, every vibration sharp. The Japanese pilots flying their Hayates and aging Zeros charged head-on. Their confidence lasted until the first tracers appeared. The two forces met with the violence of colliding worlds. The Mustangs dove from altitude at nearly 500 miles per hour, their 6 Brownings spitting a torrent of fire that shredded the formation below. Tracer lines crossed the sky in red and white streaks, cutting through the haze like molten wires. One Key 84 disintegrated instantly, its right wing snapping clean off in a burst of flame. Another spun helplessly toward the sea smoke trailing like a black ribbon. Tapp's voice crackled over the radio, calm, clipped, deadly efficient. "Brake left, dive and climb, don't get slow." For the Japanese pilots, the fight became a nightmare of physics. Their aircraft, agile at low altitude, began to gasp in the thin air above 2,500 feet. The single-stage superchargers couldn't feed the engines enough oxygen. Power bled away, controls stiffened. In their cockpits, needles trembled and oil pressure dropped. The Mustangs, by contrast, thrived in that rarefied space. The Packard-built Merlins sang at full boost superchargers, switching seamlessly between gears. Every dive felt like falling through time, 500 miles an hour straight down the earth, spinning faster than thought, the wings steady as stone. Tapp lined up a Key 61 Hien climbing to meet him. The Japanese pilot, unaware of the speed difference, tried to pull into a head-on pass. Tapp squeezed the trigger. 6 machine guns roared together, 80 rounds per second, hammering into the enemy fighter. The canopy burst, the engine exploded, and the Hien vanished in a blossom of fire. Tapp didn't even watch it fall. He rolled out, climbed, and scanned for the next threat. Around him the sky was chaos, contrails twisting like smoke trails from burning incense, fragments of aircraft tumbling through sunlight. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen later wrote that the combat over Tokyo felt unreal, like fighting inside a mirror of light and shadow. You couldn't tell where the sky ended and the ocean began, he said. 1 second you were chasing a silhouette, the next you were staring into the sun blinded, pulling the trigger because you had to. The Mustangs fought like predators that had just discovered new hunting grounds. They attacked in pairs, diving through Japanese formations, firing short bursts, then zoom climbing back to altitude before their opponents could react. The enemy tried to follow but couldn't. Their engines screamed, their wings shuddered, their airframes creaked with the strain. The faster they chased, the more they disintegrated. From the ground, Japanese civilians saw streaks in the sky, white arcs and flashes of fire over their own capital. To them, it looked like lightning trapped in a cage of clouds. The myth of safety, of divine protection, cracked that morning. The air raid sirens had barely started when flaming debris began to fall into Tokyo Bay. Soldiers on the ground stared upward in disbelief. American fighters, single-engine fighters, were dueling over their homeland. The impossible had taken shape before their eyes. For the men in the air, time stretched thin. Every minute felt like an hour, every second, a decision between life and death. TAP's wingman, Lieutenant Frank Cummings, watched a Ki-43 dive straight toward him, guns blazing. He pulled hard into a roll, the G-suit tightening around his legs, keeping the blood in his head. The Japanese pilot, without such protection, blacked out under the strain. His plane shot past harmlessly, then pitched nose down into the sea. The gap between courage and technology had become a chasm. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When the Mustangs reformed, the sky was littered with burning wrecks. 26 Japanese planes confirmed, destroyed, 5 more probable. 2 American fighters lost, 1 to enemy fire, 1 to mechanical failure. The ratio told the story better than words could. Above Tokyo Bay, the P-51 had proved not only its reach but its dominance. What had begun as a mission of escort became a revelation. Japan's air defense, once feared, was broken. Yet victory carried an undertone of awe. As TAP's formation turned for home, he looked down at the haze-shrouded city below. Smoke drifted from the coastline, rising in lazy spirals. He felt no triumph, only the strange stillness that follows a storm. He knew what this meant, not just for them, but for the men they had fought. The Japanese pilots were brave, desperate, but doomed by the machines they flew and the fuel that barely burned in their tanks. They fought for an idea that the war itself had already buried. When the Mustangs landed back at Iwo Jima, their wings streaked with oil and salt. The mechanics counted bullet holes, dozens in some planes, none catastrophic. The engines kept running smooth as the moment they'd left. The pilots climbed down their legs, trembling, their faces pale. TAP removed his oxygen mask, took a deep breath of sulfur and volcanic dust, and said quietly, "They never stood a chance." News of the mission spread faster than the smoke over Tokyo. To the Japanese, it was more than a battle lost. It was an omen. If American fighters could appear over the Imperial Palace, what sanctuary remained? The invincible sky had turned hostile, its guardians powerless. For centuries, Japan had believed in the divine wind, the kamikaze that once saved it from invasion. But no wind could stop the storm of steel that had come this morning. The dogfight over Tokyo was brief, merciless, and final. It was not just an aerial engagement. It was the moment a nation realized its myths had died. The thunder of the Mustang's guns was not merely the sound of victory, it was the sound of inevitability. From that day on, every Japanese pilot who climbed into a cockpit knew the truth written across the sky. The war in the air was over, even if the war on the ground had yet to end. The Empire's heart still beat, but its wings had been torn away. What made that victory possible again and again? What allowed those silver-winged Mustangs to rise from volcanic rock, cross an ocean fight over the heart of an empire, and return home as if it were routine? The answer was not luck or divine guidance, it was mathematics. It was the cold arithmetic of logistics, technology, and training, the invisible architecture that turned courage into results and machines into destiny. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every turn of a wrench was part of an equation that America had learned to solve and Japan no longer could. Behind each flight of 91 Mustangs stood an army of unseen hands. On Iwo Jima, mechanics worked knee-deep in black sand. their faces streaked with oil-rebuilding engines in 4 hours that other nations would take days to replace. Supply ships unloaded drums of 100-octane gasoline around the clock, guarded as if they were gold. C-54 transports ferried crates of spare parts from island to island, guided by radio beacons and weather reports transmitted from submarines floating silently beneath the Pacific. Every bolt hose and bullet had a serial number logged, tracked, and replaced before it failed. When a P-51 returned riddled with holes, ground crews had it flying again by dawn. It was an ecosystem of precision. The U.S. Army Air Forces did not rely on heroism. They relied on systems. They calculated fuel burn by the minute, bomb loads by altitude, and radio frequencies by region. Even rescue was engineered. Submarines nicknamed lifeguards waited along the Mustang's route, their periscopes scanning for parachutes or life rafts. If a pilot went down, PBY Catalinas swooped in for the recovery within hours. No man was ever truly alone, and that knowledge gave every pilot the courage to push farther, fly longer, fight harder. On the other side of the war, Japan's system had collapsed into improvisation. Their airfields were mud and grass, their fuel reserves measured in days, not weeks. Mechanics stripped one plane to repair another. Radios crackled with static or failed entirely. When an aircraft crashed at takeoff, its wreckage was scavenged for aluminum before the smoke cleared. Communication between air units and ground command was erratic, relying on hand signals, colored flares, and luck. Rescue operations were almost non-existent. If a pilot ditched into the ocean, he vanished. His name was recorded, his uniform folded his story over. The contrast was merciless. On Iwo Jima, every gallon of fuel burned in a Mustang could be traced back to an oil field in Texas, refined in California, shipped across the Pacific, and offloaded onto that black beach within a schedule measured in hours. Japan's pilots flew on synthetic gasoline distilled from pine roots, each drop the product of desperation. It took 200 tree stumps to make 1 gallon of low-grade fuel that ruined engines faster than it propelled them. The Americans moved through a seamless machine of supply. The Japanese fought through the fragments of a dying one. Training mirrored this divide. American pilots averaged 600 hours of flight time before seeing combat. They practiced deflection shooting on towed targets, drilled in formation flying, and learned to trust their instruments in storm and darkness. They studied enemy aircraft, memorized silhouettes, and trained against instructors who mimicked enemy tactics. When a Mustang pilot entered battle, he carried not just skill, but method. Every move, every burst, every climb was an execution of a rehearsed equation. Japanese replacements arrived at the front with barely 50 hours in the air, sometimes less. Many had never fired their weapons outside of classroom simulation. They were taught in a rush, then thrown into a sky they could barely navigate, flying machines they barely understood. Their instructors were either dead or still fighting. In the cockpit, fear replaced discipline. Maneuvers that required instinct and training turned into flailing reactions. They faced American pilots who fought like mathematicians, calculating lead angles, conserving energy, mastering the geometry of the dogfight, while they themselves were still learning how to stay airborne. Technology extended that advantage beyond human limits. The Mustang's G-suit kept blood flowing to the brain during high G turns, allowing pilots to stay conscious while pulling maneuvers that made Japanese flyers black out. Oxygen regulators automatically adjusted with altitude radios, offered multiple clear channels, and standardized navigation instruments allowed flight in cloud or darkness. The cockpit was not a cage, it was a laboratory of control. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots strapped into aircraft with failing radios, unreliable gauges, and oxygen tanks that often froze above 2,000 feet. Some flew without parachutes, convinced they would never survive a bailout anyway. The difference between the two nations' cockpits was not just in hardware, but in philosophy. One trusted systems, the other trusted spirit. One invested in redundancy, the other in sacrifice. Even weather favored the Americans not by chance but by design. Dedicated meteorological B-29 seconds flew ahead of every mission, mapping winds and fronts. Data was transmitted back to Iwo Jima and plotted into flight charts. If a storm was forming, the route was adjusted. When one mission, Black Friday, was lost to unexpected weather, the system changed. More reconnaissance, better prediction, stricter communication. Every failure became a refinement. The system learned as fast as the men within it. Japan had no such network. Pilots took off into skies they hadn't seen, guided by outdated maps and guesswork. Many never returned, not because of the enemy, but because of clouds. Whole squadrons vanished into storms, consumed by their own ignorance. To fly for Japan in 1945 was to gamble with physics itself. In the end, war was reduced to equations of replacement and repair. America could build 20 Mustangs in a day. Japan might finish one Hayate in the same time if the power stayed on. American factories standardized every component, making every plane identical and interchangeable. Japan's factories bombed, and starving built aircraft by hand, each one unique, each one fragile. The Americans turned warfare into a science of replication. The Japanese, trapped in dwindling craftsmanship, fought a war they could no longer sustain. And yet, within that cold arithmetic lay something profoundly human. The pilots who flew the Mustangs understood that their strength came not from the machine alone, but from the invisible millions who stood behind it. The factory workers who built the engines, the sailors who guarded the convoys, the meteorologists who charted the weather, all were threads in a single pattern. When they flew, they carried an entire civilization's capacity to organize, produce, and adapt. That realization blurred the line between machine and man. Victory no longer depended on who was braver or who flew faster, but on who could sustain the fight. The true weapon was not the P-51's guns or the Merlin's roar. It was the ability to repeat perfection day after day, storm after storm, without breaking. By the time the Mustangs returned from their missions, black with exhaust and salt, the numbers had already been tallied. Fuel-consumed rounds, fired engines, serviced sorties logged. It was not poetry but precision. And from that precision came power the kind that bent empires. War had become an equation, and America had mastered its formula. Japan was fighting with faith. America was fighting with calculus. One built hope, the other built logistics, and in the furnace of 1,945 hope was combustible. But as the Mustangs taxied in under the red dusk of Iwo Jima, streaked with oil and ash, the pilots saw more than numbers. They saw the faces of mechanics waiting with tools of signalmen guiding them home, of comrades counting the returned and the lost. Beneath all the math and machinery still beat a human heart, steady, exhausted, and relentless. Because in the end, even in a world ruled by systems and steel, it was belief that kept those engines running. Belief that what they built mattered. Belief that precision could save lives. Belief that somewhere inside the cold logic of war, there was still something worth fighting for. By late summer, the skies above Japan had fallen silent. The roar of engines that once symbolized defiance was gone, replaced by the low hum of American patrols, cruising unchallenged over cities reduced to ash. Smoke from the firebombed districts still curled upward, but there were no interceptors to meet the intruders, no radar warnings, no hurried takeoffs. Airfields lay deserted, pocked with bomb craters and the twisted wreckage of what had once been Japan's shield. The silence was more terrifying than any battle. It was the sound of defeat made absolute. For the pilots of the Mustangs, that silence was surreal. Just months earlier, every mission had meant combat, every cloud could hide an enemy. Now they flew without resistance. They strafed rail yards, bridges, and airstrips with impunity, their guns cutting across the landscape like handwriting, spelling the end of an empire. The psychological collapse of Japan's air defense was total. Where once thousands of aircraft had guarded the home islands, only a handful remained flyable, most grounded for lack of fuel or parts. Those that did rise into the air often crashed before reaching altitude, their engines coughing on impure gasoline. The empire that had once prided itself on mastery of the air now watched foreign fighters circle its own capital like hawks over a dying animal. Strategically, the consequences were irreversible. Without air cover, Japan's industrial heart was left naked. The precision daylight raids that the P-51 seconds enabled reduced entire cities to rubble. Steel mills, shipyards, and refineries vanished under rolling curtains of fire. The vast machine that had once built the Zero, the Hayate, and the battleships of the Imperial Navy was broken not just physically but spiritually. Every bomb that fell was a reminder that their empire could no longer defend itself, that their gods had gone silent. Even the most loyal citizens began to understand that courage could not fuel aircraft, and prayers could not replace steel. On the ground, despair turned to fatalism. Mothers looked skyward and saw contrails crossing the sun. Children learned to tell the difference between the sound of a Mustang and a B-29. Factories tried to continue production beneath open frameworks of bombed roofs. Workers hammered at melted tools, scavenging from the ruins of yesterday to build for a tomorrow that no longer existed. The once proud discipline of Japanese industry had been reduced to improvisation, and the once feared Bushido spirit, unquestioning loyalty to the emperor, was now fighting against hunger and exhaustion. The war had become a ritual carried out by a nation that already knew its fate. Yet, the defeat that unfolded in those skies went beyond strategy or destruction. It was the death of a belief system. Japan's military had built its power on the worship of courage, on the conviction that willpower could overcome technology, that the warrior spirit could compensate for material weakness. But the P-51 Mustang proved otherwise. It was not bravery that crossed 700 miles of ocean and returned unscathed. It was precision, discipline, and the mastery of science. The Empire of Japan had fought a war of emotion against a civilization that fought with equations. The result was inevitable. This was not the failure of pilots or engineers, but of an ideology that refused to evolve. The Bushido Code that had once given Japan its ferocity now chained it to the past. While America turned industry into art, Japan turned sacrifice into policy. The result was an empire that consumed its heroes faster than it could replace them. The final months of the war revealed that truth with brutal clarity, spirit without system, is suicide. The divine wind had become a whisper, drowned beneath the hum of machinery. Out of this collapse, a new world began to form. The lessons carved into the skies over Tokyo reshaped how nations thought about power. Military strength was no longer measured in swords or courage, but in factories, fuel, and data. The formula was simple: strength equaled production plus standardization plus knowledge. It was this equation that would define the second half of the 20th century, from the jet age to the space race. Every piston that turned, every assembly line that moved, was a continuation of the logic born from those April skies. For Japan, the irony was profound. The nation that had been defeated by technology became one of its greatest disciples. In the decades after the war, the same obsessive discipline that once built warplanes would rebuild cities, industries, and eventually a new kind of empire, one made not of conquests, but of innovation. The factories that once assembled Hi-8s would one day produce cars, cameras, and circuits that conquered the world in peace. The transformation was the ultimate admission that power in the modern age belonged to those who understood the machine, not those who merely worshipped valor. As the war's final weeks unfolded, the Mustangs continued their missions, though by then there was little left to destroy. They flew over empty airfields, their guns' silent engines echoing through the void where once the enemy had risen to meet them. Pilots looked down on the smouldering ruins and saw the end of an era, the twilight of the warrior and the dawn of the engineer. The age of spirit had bowed to the age of systems, and yet within that triumph lingered a trace of melancholy. The same precision that had won the war had also stripped it of romance. The heroes who returned from Iwo Jima were not celebrated as knights, but as operators of a machine that had outthought the enemy. They had proven a truth both magnificent and cold, that courage alone could no longer shape the outcome of history. The new gods of war were factories, data, and design. From the skies of Tokyo in 1945, humanity learned its harshest equation. Bravery was necessary, but not sufficient. Valor could ignite a moment, but only knowledge could sustain an age. The Mustangs that soared through the morning haze carried more than ammunition, they carried the future. Their victory marked the end of one world and the beginning of another, where strength would forever be measured not by the heart's fire, but by the mind's precision. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a silence that echoed across the Pacific. Over Tokyo's shattered skyline, the last contrails of the Mustangs faded into the sunrise, a symbol of power forged from steel, intellect, and will. The age of the sword had yielded to the age of the machine. From that sky, humanity learned a truth that would shape the modern world. Courage wins moments, but knowledge builds empires. The P-51D's roar was more than victory. It was the sound of civilization, evolving the moment when the mind, not the myth, claimed dominion over the sky.